The car on the ramp here is a front wheel drive transversely mounted engine. And we're going to have a look as to what's involved in taking the gearbox out of this car. You can see the air filter and battery there above the gearbox They'll have to be removed. The engine and gearbox are held in with two mountings, one either side, one below the engine there and one holding the gearbox up that's below the battery. The gearbox mounting has to be removed. In order to remove the gearbox, we'll have to support the engine. Underneath the car, both the wheels and the drive shafts would have to be removed. Passenger side drive shaft will have to be removed. Oil will need to be drained from the gearbox out of the drain plug here, and then we will then have to remove the drive shaft as well from the driver's side. This is the engine beam that will support the engine, as we will only have one mounting holding it in after we remove the gearbox mounting. This will support the weight of the engine along with the other engine mounting. Underneath, once we start removing the gearbox mounting, we'll need to support the engine gearbox assembly with a transmission jack. This will let us take the weight of the gearbox to allow us to remove it. We'll have to remove all the bell housing bolts. This engine and the stand is what you'll have to remove. You will be required to move the gearbox from the engine on this stand as part of your task and replace the clutch assembly. As you can see, the gearbox is bolted to the engine through the bell housing bolts, and is also held in place with a gearbox mounting. All the bolts will be required to be removed, and as you're doing the job, I suggest you take the weight of the gearbox using a jack. This will allow you then to safely remove all the mounting bolts and the bell housing bolts safely. Once all the bolts are removed, you can then, with the aid of an assistant working the trolley jack, you will be able to remove the gearbox safely from the stand. This will allow you access to the clutch assembly.
Same button again to stop.
Once the gearbox is removed, we're able to see the clutch assembly bolted to the flywheel. The centre part is the part that drives the input shaft, and this part, the diaphragm spring fingers, are what the release bearing acts upon. These are the bolts that hold the pressure plate to the flywheel. Looking at the gearbox, this is the clutch release bearing. It's driven from the clutch plate. Now press the release bearing operating lever, and we can see the release bearing moving in and out as it would do when you depress the clutch pedal. We'll now remove the pressure plate and examine the clutch. All the bolts are removed evenly so as not to distort the clutch pressure plate. When the clutch is removed, we can examine the flywheel, check the area that the area that the friction plate acts upon, check there's no scores in it and it's not damaged. You can also check the friction plate and have a look at the pressure plate assembly. Check all sides of the pressure plate, check there's no damage. And to reassemble the clutch assembly, we need a clutch aligning tool that centres the clutch friction plate in the exact centre of the flywheel. This will enable easy installation of the gearbox, as the gearbox shaft has to enter the splines of the clutch friction plate. Once it's aligned up, we can enter the bolts, which must also be tightened evenly up to save distorting the clutch pressure plate. Once tightened, the bolts then required to be torqued up to the correct torque, and finally the gearbox can be refitted to the engine. Once the bolts and the pressure plate have been tightened, the clutch centering tool can be removed. There's locating dowels between the bolts and the pressure plate. These locate the pressure plate in the correct position. We're now ready to put the gearbox in after the final torque of the bolts.
Yeah. Right, I'll hand. Come here, Mario.
That's one more.
Thank Donald.
Once the gearbox is back in place, we can enter the bell housing bolts and start to tighten them up. So maybe just go back a wee bit, Duncan, and take one of the view, show them with the jack there too. And then I'll get the last two mountain, I'll get these two mountain bolts. We're then able to enter the gearbox mounting bolts, secure them with the nuts, and they can be tightened up. Any final remaining bell housing bolts can then be screwed in and tightened up. Then the final job is to remove the trolley jack from underneath the gearbox and put all the tools away.